The farmers were tricked out of their own company, and most of them didn't realize it until it was already gone. In the 1940s, hundreds of Queensland pineapple growers did something extraordinary. They pooled their own money and built their own cannery for one reason, so that no distant owner could ever again hold power over them. They built it as a fortress, a company that could not be bought, because the only way to own a piece of it was to grow the fruit. For 60 years it worked. The growers owned the cannery, the profit came back to the people who did the work, and the yellow circle on the tin meant exactly what it looked like: Queensland fruit, grown and canned and owned by Queenslanders. And then they were talked into taking the walls down. They were told it was about the future, about capital, about competing with the big companies, about securing the jobs and the farms for their children. They were told that converting their cooperative into an ordinary company, with shares, real shares, worth real money that they could finally sell, was the responsible thing to do. It felt like a windfall, a lifetime of delivering fruit, suddenly worth a cash payout. What they were not told, in plain enough words, was that the moment they did it, they were removing the one thing that had ever kept the company in their hands. The instant the fortress became a normal company, it became a target. And once it was a target, the outcome was no longer up to the farmers at all. It was up to the market. Within a few years, the company the growers built to protect themselves had been corporatized, floated, fought over, and sold to the American food giant Heinz. The ketchup company, headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, today part of one of the largest food conglomerates on earth, steered out of Chicago and Pittsburgh by a Brazilian private equity firm and the investment company of Warren Buffett. The grandchildren of the men who built the cannery to escape distant owners now deliver their fruit to the most distant owner imaginable, on the other side of the world, with no ownership, no say, and no share of the profit. They are right back where their grandfathers started. The tin still has the yellow circle. The pineapple is still grown on the red soil up the coast. It still sits in the pantry of every house in the country. The sliced rings you put on the Christmas ham, the crushed pineapple in the carrot cake, the tropical fruit salad with the one cherry everybody fought over. It still looks Australian. It just isn't theirs anymore. This is the story of how it was done, step by step, vote by vote, and how an entire generation of Australian farmers was quietly talked out of the empire they built with their own hands. Chapter 1. The problem with pineapples. Here is the part of the Golden Circle story nobody tells. It did not start with a founder. It started with a grievance. To understand why Golden Circle exists, you have to understand the position of a pineapple grower in southeast Queensland in the years before the Second World War. Pineapples are a tropical and subtropical crop, and the country in the coastal hinterland north and south of Brisbane, places like the Glasshouse Mountains, with their volcanic red soil and their warm, wet summers, turned out to be very good at growing them. By the early 20th century, there were a lot of pineapple farms in that country. Family farms, mostly. Hard, hand-worked blocks where a family grew fruit on a few acres and lived or died by what they could sell it for. And here was the problem. A pineapple is not wheat. You cannot store it in a silo and sell it when the price is right. It ripens on its own schedule, in a glut, all at once, and then it rots. A grower with a paddock full of ripe pineapples is a grower with a deadline measured in days. He has to sell now at whatever price he is offered, because the alternative is watching the crop turn to mush in the field. This is the oldest trap in agriculture, and it is the reason so much of Australian farming organised itself into cooperatives. When you grow a perishable crop, the people who buy it from you, the canneries, the wholesalers, the agents, hold all the power. They know you cannot wait. They know the fruit is rotting, so they offer you a low price, and you take it, because some money is better than a paddock of compost. The grower takes all the risk: the weather, the pests, the labour, the capital tied up in the land. And the buyer, who took none of that risk, takes the margin. For decades, Queensland pineapple growers lived inside that trap. They grew the fruit. Someone else got rich canning it. And in the 1940s, a critical mass of them decided they had had enough. The idea was simple and old and powerful. If the growers themselves owned the cannery, then the profit that had always flowed to a distant owner would flow back to the people who grew the fruit. No middleman. No buyer holding the whip hand over a perishable crop. The grower would deliver his pineapples to a cannery that he part-owned, and at the end of the year, the cannery's profits would come back to him as a member of the cooperative. The risk and the reward would sit in the same hands for the first time. That was the whole idea behind Golden Circle. It was not a company that happened to buy from farmers. It was the farmers, organised into a company. And in 1947, they opened a cannery to prove it could work. Chapter 2. The cannery at Northgate. The cannery was built at Northgate, an industrial suburb on the northern side of Brisbane, well placed for rail and for road, close enough to the growing districts to take the fruit in fast before it spoiled. It opened in 1947. Picture what that meant in 1947. The war had been over for 2 years. Australia was rebuilding. Rationing was still a recent memory, and a large new food processing factory in suburban Brisbane was a genuine event, a source of hundreds of jobs, a customer for thousands of tons of local fruit, an anchor for a whole community. The Golden Circle Cannery became one of the major employers of its part of Brisbane. People got jobs there straight out of school and stayed for 40 years. Families had 3 generations work the lines. The seasonal peak, when the pineapple harvest came in and the cannery ran around the clock to process the glut before it spoiled, drew in extra workers from all over the district. The State Library of Queensland keeps records of this period, and the picture that comes through is consistent. The Golden Circle Cannery was not just a factory. It was the economic and social heart of its area. It provided steady, decent industrial work in a city that needed it. It gave the surrounding pineapple farms a guaranteed buyer that they themselves owned. And it turned a perishable, glut-prone tropical fruit into shelf-stable products that could be sold across Australia and shipped around the world. There is a particular texture to a cannery town, or a cannery suburb, that is worth describing, because it explains why the loss of local ownership matters, in a way that goes beyond economics. A cannery is seasonal in a way that shapes the whole rhythm of a community. When the harvest comes in, the fruit cannot wait, so the plant runs flat out. Extra shifts, extra workers, the lines going around the clock to process the glut before it spoils. Whole families would work the season. School leavers got their first job on the line. Women who wanted seasonal work that fit around their families found it at the cannery. Retired men picked up shifts during the peak. The plant breathed in and out with the harvest, drawing the community in when the fruit was ready and easing off when it was done. For generations, working at Golden Circle was simply part of what people in that part of Brisbane did. It was woven into the place. And it was theirs, in a way that is hard to recapture now. The people working the line might well be related to, or neighbours of, the growers supplying the fruit. The cannery was owned by those growers. The whole circuit, the farm, the fruit, the factory, the jobs, the profit, was local, closed, and self-reinforcing. Money made from Queensland pineapples, grown by Queensland families, processed by Queensland workers, came back to Queensland. That is what a cooperative, at its best, produces. Not just a fair price, but a local economy that owns itself. The name was a piece of plain genius: Golden Circle. The Golden Circle is the ring of sliced pineapple, the literal shape of the product when you open the tin. But it also evokes the sun, the warmth, the tropics, the gold of ripe fruit. And the circle suggests completeness, community, a ring of growers standing together. Whether the founders intended all of that, or just like the picture of a pineapple ring, the name worked. The yellow circle became one of the most recognised marks in the Australian pantry, and the product range grew far beyond pineapple. The cannery learned to process all the tropical and subtropical fruit of the region. And then, as canneries do, it expanded into everything a cannery can make. Fruit salad, tropical fruit in juice, beetroot, and the savoury lines that would put Golden Circle into the pantry of households that never thought about where their pineapple came from. Canned spaghetti, baked beans, the cheap, filling, shelf-stable staples of the Australian childhood. There was a generation of Australians for whom Golden Circle spaghetti on buttered toast was the taste of a weeknight tea, and Golden Circle tropical fruit salad with a bit of ice cream was the taste of Sunday. By the second half of the 20th century, Golden Circle was not a pineapple company. It was a major Australian food manufacturer, owned by farmers, anchored in Brisbane, with the yellow circle on products in every aisle. For decades, it worked exactly as the founders had hoped. The growers delivered their fruit. The cannery processed and sold it. The profits came back to the growers. The risk and the reward sat in the same hands. It was, for a long time, one of the great success stories of the Australian cooperative movement. Proof that farmers who organised could build something that served them instead of something that extracted from them. But a cooperative is a particular kind of structure, and it carries a particular kind of vulnerability. And by the end of the century, that vulnerability was about to be exposed. Chapter 3. The cooperative. To understand how Golden Circle was lost, you have to understand what a cooperative actually is, and why, for all its strengths, it sits on a fault line. A cooperative is owned by its members. In Golden Circle's case, the members were the growers who supplied the fruit. They did not own shares that traded on a stock exchange. They owned a stake in a mutual enterprise tied to their role as suppliers. The purpose of the cooperative was not to maximize the value of those shares. It was to serve the members by giving them a fair and guaranteed return on their fruit. Profit was a means to that end, not the end itself. This is a fundamentally different animal from a normal company. A normal company exists to make money for its shareholders, and its shares can be bought and sold by anyone, which means the company can be taken over by anyone with enough money. A cooperative exists to serve its members, and its ownership is locked to those members, which makes it very hard for an outsider to buy. For as long as Golden Circle was a true grower cooperative, it was effectively takeover-proof. You could not buy it because the people who owned it were not selling shares. They were selling pineapples. That protection is also a limitation. Cooperatives are notoriously starved of capital. A normal company that needs money to expand, to modernize, to build a new production line or buy a competitor can issue new shares and raise the cash from investors. A cooperative cannot easily do that because issuing shares to outside investors would dilute the members' control and change the nature of the thing. So cooperatives tend to grow slowly, fund themselves out of retained earnings, and struggle to find the large lumps of capital that modern food manufacturing demands. The automated lines, the packaging technology, the marketing budgets needed to fight the multinationals on the supermarket shelf. By the late 20th century, Golden Circle was caught in exactly this bind. It was competing against enormous, well-capitalized, often foreign-owned food companies. It needed money to modernize and to grow. And the cooperative structure that had protected it for half a century was now the thing standing between it and the capital it felt it needed. There is a word for what happens next, and it is one of the quietly fatal words in the history of mutual enterprises: demutualization. Demutualisation is the process by which a cooperative or mutual converts itself into an ordinary, investor-owned company. The members vote to give up their mutual structure in exchange for shares, tradable shares with a market value that can be sold. On the day it happens, it can feel like a windfall. The members who held an illiquid stake in a mutual suddenly hold shares worth real money that they can sell on a market. For a grower who has spent 40 years delivering pineapples, the prospect of his stake suddenly having a cash value can be very attractive. But demutualisation is also the moment the protection comes off. The instant a cooperative becomes a normal company with tradable shares, it becomes something it could never be before: buyable. The lock is removed, and once the shares are out there, trading, anyone with enough money can start buying them. The thing the growers built to keep themselves free of distant owners becomes, in a single structural change, available to exactly such an owner. Golden Circle demutualised. The grower cooperative became a company. And the clock started ticking. It is worth being precise about why this is the hinge of the entire story, because demutualisation is one of those bloodless financial words that hides an enormous consequence. For more than 50 years, Golden Circle had been, in effect, impossible to steal. Not because it was small or obscure or unattractive. It was none of those things. But because there was nothing to buy. You cannot mount a takeover of a company whose owners are not selling shares, because there are no shares on the market to accumulate. The growers held their stake by virtue of being growers. The only way to buy in was to grow pineapples and join the cooperative. That structural fact was a wall, and behind that wall, the company was safe from the entire apparatus of corporate takeovers. The raiders, the funds, the multinationals, the whole machinery that, across the same decades, was steadily acquiring every other Australian food icon. Demutualisation knocked the wall down. In a single structural decision, the thing that could never be bought became a thing that was for sale like anything else. And the growers who voted for it were, in a sense, voting on a question they could not fully see the end of. They were told it was about capital, about competitiveness, about securing the future, and those arguments were real. What was less visible, in the moment, was that they were also voting to remove the one thing that had kept the company in their hands. The windfall was immediate and concrete. Shares with a cash value, a stake you could finally sell. The cost was abstract and deferred, the loss of the protection itself. And abstract deferred costs almost always lose to immediate concrete benefits, which is exactly why demutualisation has hollowed out so many mutuals and cooperatives, not just in Australia, but around the world. Chapter 4. The Corporation. When Golden Circle converted from a cooperative into a corporation, the logic was the logic that always accompanies these decisions. The business needed capital. It needed to modernise. It needed the flexibility that a corporate structure provides. The growers were told, and many of them believed, with good reason, that becoming a normal company was the way to secure the future, to compete, to grow, to protect the jobs at Northgate and the market for their fruit. And there was truth in it. The competitive pressures were real. The Australian grocery market was consolidating into the hands of two enormous supermarket chains, which used their buying power to squeeze suppliers relentlessly on price. The food manufacturers on the other side of that negotiation were increasingly global giants with deep pockets. A medium-sized, capital-starved, farmer-owned cannery in Brisbane was in a genuinely difficult position, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. The people who argued for converting Golden Circle into a corporation were not villains. Many of them were growers themselves, trying to do the responsible thing for an asset they cared about. But structure is destiny. Once Golden Circle was a corporation with tradable shares, the things that happened to corporations began to happen to it. Ownership began to spread and shift. The tight identity between the company and its growers, the thing that had defined it for half a century, began to loosen. The company was now an asset in a market, and assets in a market get valued, get traded, and eventually get fought over. And Golden Circle, it turned out, was an attractive asset. It had iconic brands. It had the yellow circle, one of the most trusted marks in the Australian pantry. It had a dominant position in pineapple and a strong presence across canned fruit, juice, and the savoury staples. It had the Northgate plant and the relationships with the growing districts. It was exactly the kind of business, established, trusted, cash-generating, slightly underexploited, that a larger food company looks at and sees an opportunity. The takeover interest, when it came from more than one direction. A trusted Australian icon with strong brands and a dominant category position does not sit quietly on the market for long. There was corporate manoeuvring. There were competing interests circling. The company that the growers had built to keep ownership in their own hands was now the object of a contest among outside buyers who wanted to take it out of those hands entirely. The details of that contest are the kind of thing best confirmed against the record before they are narrated as fact. Who bid, when, how much, and how the board and the remaining grower shareholders responded. But the shape of it is the shape of this entire channel. A beloved Australian brand, no longer protected by the structure that once kept it local, becomes a target, and the question is no longer whether it will be bought, but by whom. The answer, in the end, was Heinz. Chapter 5. The Ketchup Company. The H.J. Heinz Company was founded in the United States in the 19th century by Henry John Heinz, and it became one of the most famous food companies in the world on the back of a single product, tomato ketchup, in the distinctive glass bottle with the 57 varieties slogan that Heinz coined, and that long outlived any literal count of its products. Headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Heinz grew into a global food multinational, selling condiments and processed foods in virtually every country on earth. Heinz had been active in Australia for a long time before it acquired Golden Circle. It already owned other Australian food assets. The pattern by which it operated was the standard pattern of the global food multinational. Acquire strong local brands in each market, keep the local names and packaging that consumers trust, and run them as regional components of a vast international portfolio, with the strategic decisions and the ultimate profits flowing back to headquarters. When Heinz acquired Golden Circle, the most Australian of pantry brands, the farmer-built, Queensland-grown Yellow Circle pineapple icon became a unit inside an American condiment empire. Sit with the specific irony, because it is the same irony that runs through every story on this channel. Golden Circle was created for the explicit purpose of freeing Queensland growers from the power of distant owners. Its entire reason for existing was that farmers should own the company that processed their fruit, so that the profit would stay with the people who took the risk. And it ended up owned by one of the largest food corporations in the world, headquartered 8,000 miles away, accountable to shareholders who had never seen a pineapple farm in the Glasshouse Mountains, and never would. The branding did not change. That is the thing the multinationals understand better than anything. The yellow circle stayed. The product of Australia messaging stayed, where it could be justified. The pineapple kept being grown in Queensland, because that is where the supply chain and the relationships were, and because Australian grown is itself a marketing asset. To the shopper reaching for a tin of pineapple, nothing visible changed. The brand still felt like what it had always felt like: Queensland, sunshine, home. But the ownership had left the country. The company built by farmers to keep ownership in farmers' hands was now owned in Pittsburgh. and it was about to be folded into something even larger. Chapter 6. Kraft Heinz. In 2015, two of the largest food companies in the world combined. The H.J. Heinz Company merged with Kraft Foods Group to form the Kraft Heinz Company, one of the biggest food and beverage businesses on earth, with a portfolio of brands sold in nearly every country in the world. The merger was engineered by two of the most powerful forces in global capital, the Brazilian private equity firm 3G Capital and Berkshire Hathaway, the investment company of Warren Buffett. The combined Kraft Heinz became a case study, taught in business schools, of a particular philosophy of running food companies. A philosophy built around relentless cost-cutting, the elimination of overhead, and the maximization of margins through a technique known as zero-based budgeting, in which every expense in every department has to be justified from zero every single year. This is the world that Golden Circle now lived inside. The farmer cooperative from Northgate, Brisbane, the company built so that growers would never again be at the mercy of a distant, profit-maximizing owner, was now a small regional asset inside one of the most aggressively cost-focused food conglomerates ever assembled, ultimately answerable to a Brazilian private equity firm and an American investment legend. There could hardly be a sharper illustration of what this channel keeps documenting. Golden Circle began as the opposite of 3G Capital. It began as an act of solidarity, farmers pooling their capital so that the people who did the work would own the result. It ended as a line item in a portfolio managed according to a philosophy whose entire purpose is to extract the maximum margin from every asset, justify every cost from zero, and return the proceeds to shareholders who are as distant from a Queensland pineapple farm as it is possible to be. The yellow circle on the tin had travelled, in the space of a few decades, from one end of the economic spectrum to the other, from a symbol of farmer ownership to a unit of value inside one of the most ruthless margin extraction machines in global business. Chapter 7. The Growers. What happened to the growers? The people the whole thing was built for. This is the part of the story that matters most and is documented least, because the growers do not issue press releases, and their experience does not show up in the annual report. But the broad outline is clear enough, and it is the same outline that has played out wherever a farmer cooperative has been corporatized and then sold. When Golden Circle demutualized, the growers received shares, a stake with a cash value, where before they had held an illiquid mutual membership. For some, particularly those near retirement or those who wanted out, that was a genuine benefit. They could sell their shares and walk away with money. The conversion to a corporation and the eventual sale put cash in the hands of growers who had spent their lives delivering fruit. That is real, and it should not be dismissed. But something else was lost that does not show up as a number. The growers had owned the cannery. That ownership had given them power. Power over the price of their fruit. Power over the decisions of the company. Power to ensure that the enterprise served them rather than extracting from them. When the cooperative became a corporation, and the corporation was sold to Heinz, that power evaporated. The growers were no longer owners. They were suppliers again, exactly what they had been before 1947, exactly the position the founders had organized the cooperative to escape. They now sold their fruit to a company owned in Pittsburgh, on terms set by that company, with no seat at the table and no share of the margin. The wheel had turned full circle, and not in a good way. The pineapple growers of southeast Queensland had spent the better part of a century inside an arc that began with them at the mercy of distant buyers, rose through the great experiment of owning their own cannery, and ended with them, once again, at the mercy of a distant buyer. The only difference was that the distant buyer was now a global conglomerate rather than a local middleman, and the distance was now measured in oceans rather than in miles. Think about what that means for an actual grower, on an actual farm, across the generations. The man who helped found the cooperative in the 1940s did it because he was sick of delivering a perishable crop to a buyer who could name any price, knowing the fruit would rot if the grower refused. He and his neighbours built the cannery to end that powerlessness, and it worked, for him and for his children. His son grew up delivering fruit to a cannery the family part-owned, sitting on the right side of the deal for the first time in the family's history, with a say in the company and a share of its profit. That son lived through the good decades when the cooperative did exactly what it was built to do. And then that son's son, the grandson, farming the same red soil, watched the protection get voted away, watched the company become a corporation, watched the corporation get sold to Heinz, and found himself back in the exact position his grandfather had organized to escape, a supplier delivering a perishable crop to a buyer on the other side of the world who could set the terms, with no ownership, no seat at the table, and no share of the margin. 3 generations to build the fortress and live inside it, a few years to take the walls down. The grandson grows the same fruit his grandfather grew, in the same place, and he is, in the way that matters most, right back where his grandfather started. And the supermarkets, the 2 giant chains that dominate Australian grocery, kept up their relentless pressure on price the whole way through, squeezing the margin at the retail end just as the global owner managed it from above. The grower in the Glasshouse Mountains, growing the same fruit on the same red soil his family had worked for generations, was now caught between a Pittsburgh owner and a Brisbane supermarket buyer, with less power than at any point since the cannery first opened. Chapter 8. The Northgate Plant. The cannery at Northgate, the physical heart of the whole story, the plant that opened in 1947 and anchored its community for generations, is the place where the abstract questions of ownership become concrete, because a factory is jobs, and jobs are families, and families are a community. For decades, the Northgate plant was one of the major employers of its part of Brisbane. The work was hard and often seasonal, geared to the rhythm of the harvest, but it was steady, and it was local, and it was, for a long time, owned by a company that had reasons beyond pure margin to keep it running. A grower cooperative does not close its own cannery on a whim, because the cannery is the whole point. It is the thing that gives the growers their market. The interests of the workers, the growers, and the company were broadly aligned, all anchored in the same place. Foreign corporate ownership changes that calculus. To a global conglomerate running its portfolio on zero-based budgeting, a plant in suburban Brisbane is not a community anchor or the heart of a cooperative dream. It is a cost centre to be assessed against alternatives. Could the same products be made more cheaply somewhere else? Could production be consolidated, automated, relocated, or outsourced? Could the land the plant sits on be worth more as something other than a cannery? These are the questions a margin-maximising owner asks about every asset, every year, and they are not questions that weigh community or history or the dream of the founders, because those things do not appear in the model. The specific fate of the Northgate site, what has been consolidated, what has been kept, what the current operating footprint looks like, and whether the plant still runs as it once did, is exactly the kind of detail that should be confirmed against current records before it is stated as fact, because these things change, and the most recent position is the one that matters. But the structural pressure is not in doubt. Under cooperative ownership, the plant was protected by the very purpose of the enterprise. Under foreign corporate ownership, it is protected by nothing except its own profitability, judged year after year against every cheaper alternative on earth. That is the trade that was made when the yellow circle left the country. The brand survived. The pineapple is still grown. But the protection that came from being owned by the people who depended on it the workers and the growers and the community. That protection is gone, traded away in the conversion from a cooperative into an asset. Chapter 9. The Pattern. Step back from Golden Circle for a moment, because the Golden Circle story is not an isolated tragedy. It is one instance of a pattern that has hollowed out the ownership of Australian food, and this channel has now told the same story enough times that the pattern is impossible to miss. Arnott's, the biscuit empire built by a bankrupt Scottish baker, owned now by a private equity fund in New York. Streets, the ice cream company started by a wounded soldier in a backshed, owned now by a multinational in Europe. Peters, the health food of a nation, owned now in a village in Yorkshire. Vegemite, the one that came home, the exception that proves the rule, bought back by Beggar after 82 years under American ownership. 4 and 20, the footy pie, owned now by a private equity firm in Hong Kong. And Golden Circle, the farmer cooperative, owned now by a ketchup conglomerate in Pittsburgh. Over and over, the same arc. An Australian original, often built by an immigrant or a soldier, or in Golden Circle's case, by hundreds of ordinary farmers acting together, grows into a national icon. It becomes, through decades of advertising and habit and childhood memory, a part of what Australians feel Australia is. And then, quietly, in a boardroom, it is sold to a foreign owner, and the only thing that does not change is the branding. The flag stays on the wrapper. The product of Australia stays on the label where it can be justified. The jingle, the logo, the trusted yellow circle, all of it stays, precisely because the foreign owner understands that the feeling of Australianness is the most valuable thing it bought. What makes Golden Circle distinct within that pattern is the cooperative dimension, and it is worth dwelling on, because it adds a layer the other stories do not have. Arnott's and Streets and Peters were always normal companies, privately held, then sold. The founders or their heirs sold what was theirs to sell. There is a melancholy to it, but no structural betrayal. Golden Circle is different. Golden Circle was deliberately built as a fortress against exactly the fate that befell it. Its entire purpose, its founding idea, was that the growers should own it, so that no distant owner could ever again hold power over them. And it was undone not by a hostile raid from outside, but by a structural decision taken from within. The demutualization that removed the fortress walls and made the takeover possible. The growers, or their representatives, voted to take the protection off. They did it for understandable reasons, under real competitive pressure, often believing it was the responsible thing to do. But the result was that the one Australian food icon explicitly designed to be unbuyable was bought. That is the particular sadness of the Golden Circle story. The others were sold. Golden Circle was given away by the slow dismantling of the very thing that was meant to keep it safe. Chapter 10. The Yellow Circle. Walk down the canned fruit aisle of any supermarket in Australia today, and the yellow circle is still there. Sliced pineapple, pineapple pieces, crushed pineapple, tropical fruit salad, beetroot, the juices, the savoury staples. The packaging is bright and familiar, and reassuringly unchanged. To the shopper reaching for a tin to put pineapple rings on the Christmas ham, nothing looks different from how it looked 30 or 50 years ago. The yellow circle still says what it has always said. Queensland, sunshine, fruit grown in the warm red country up the coast. And much of that is still true, which is what makes it so disorienting. The pineapples really are still grown in Queensland. The fruit really does still come off farms in the subtropical country north and south of Brisbane. The products really are, in large part, still made in Australia. In the narrow physical sense, Golden Circle is still what it appears to be. An Australian pineapple brand, sourcing Australian fruit, selling it in Australian shops, There is no lie on the label. What is gone is the thing you cannot see. The ownership. The company that the yellow circle represents is not owned by Queensland farmers anymore, and has not been for years. It is owned by Kraft Heinz, the global conglomerate forged in Pittsburgh and Chicago, steered by a Brazilian private equity firm and the investment vehicle of an American billionaire. The profit that the founders fought to keep in the hands of the people who grew the fruit now flows, ultimately, to shareholders on the other side of the world. The growers who still supply the fruit are suppliers, not owners, exactly as they were before 1947, before a generation of Queensland farmers decided to do something about it. The men and women who built the Golden Circle co-operative are mostly gone now. They were, by definition, people of the 1940s, farmers who had lived through the Depression and the war, who knew what it was to be squeezed by a buyer who held all the cards, and who built something extraordinary to make sure their children would not be. For half a century, it worked. Their children delivered fruit to a cannery their families owned, and the profit came home. Their grandchildren deliver fruit to a cannery owned in Pittsburgh. Chapter 11. What survived? The Golden Circle story ends the way all of these stories end, with a brand that outlived the dream that created it. The brand survived. The yellow circle is one of the most durable marks in the Australian pantry, and it will probably still be on the shelf long after everyone who remembers the cooperative is gone. The pineapple survived. Queensland still grows it. The cannery still cans it. The tins still ship to supermarkets across the country. The products survived, mostly unchanged, doing the same quiet work in the same pantries they have done for 3 generations. In every visible, tangible, everyday sense, Golden Circle is still here, still Australian, still exactly what it always was. What did not survive is the idea. The idea was the whole point. The radical, hopeful, deeply practical idea that the people who grow the fruit should own the company that sells it. That the risk and the reward should sit in the same hands. That farmers, acting together, could build a fortress against the distant owners who had always held power over them. That idea was Golden Circle's reason for existing, and it is the one thing the company no longer embodies. The fortress was dismantled from within, the protection was traded away, and the empire the growers built ended up owned by precisely the kind of distant, margin-maximizing power it was created to escape. There is a lesson in it that goes well beyond pineapples. Golden Circle is what happens when a community builds something to protect itself, and then a later generation, under pressure and for understandable reasons, takes the protection off. The fortress only works if you keep the walls up. The moment the cooperative became a normal company, the outcome was no longer in the grower's hands. It was in the market's hands, and the market does what the market does. It finds the assets that are undervalued, and it buys them, and it sends the profit to whoever holds the shares. The yellow circle still says Queensland. The pineapple is still grown on the red soil up the coast. The tin still goes on the Christmas ham. It just doesn't belong to the farmers anymore. The brand survived. The empire the growers built did not.